I would put it
Around the
under,
corner, maybe?
yeah, around the corner.
Behind there. No, I mean, I think that's good. I think you're right, like. I don't know how many students. I got it. Hey. Ready?
Can you do me a favor? Can you take your big right? Some stand tall. Don't ruin the sound. Don't just like, oh my god.
I do really love this.
It just needs to be.
Yeah. Did you change it or is it still?
No, you change it from what you were going to this. And he's not gonna draw something else bad.
Bigger? Smaller?
They need something. Oh my god, they were like this big.
Right?
Maybe not as overflow, right?
There or 108?
Both.
Yeah.
Can we put these up against the wall? You can do whatever you want to do.
Very nice to see you.
I'm not sure. It may have been received by another
I arrived very, very late on Thursday. Just the snow came. So the flight was landed about 5. You, same sweater.
Hi, Bill.
Hello. The Koch brothers. The whole damn family. Nice to see you. Nice to see you in my town.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, it took, so the snow came. Very nice to see you. A taxi from JFK to Grand Central Station, 4 hours. Just in a taxi. All the bridges are closed. And then I had to get a train up to Yale.
Because it was snowing exactly when you arrived. Yeah.
He's gonna sit.
Yeah, so we needed a train.
Charlie's office.
Yeah.
Or you know that.
Charlie's office.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
You can leave that there or.
Yeah,
you can put it in one of our
yeah.
offices.
Aperture gave me a bunch of the photo book review to
Oh,
distribute. I'll just leave them there.
Yeah, it's good.
Oh, you did? Awesome.
Yeah.
What's the theme for this year's?
Well, you know. Yeah.
Broke from, other things, yeah.
Hey, man, how are you?
You all right?
Yes, I'm well.
You can sit in my office, go out, you'll eat anything, water.
I'll just check my.
The book is
You never have it anyway,
well, somebody needs to.
Sitting money,
You have to-
okay.
We can't, we're not allowed to do it. I don't swear. They don't let us. Things are good. Yeah, look, beautiful.
The beauty, right?
The image just came out great. Right here is so good.
It would be, it could be improving, you know.
Do my best.
Probably
So I
needs
tried
better
to,
than that.
a nice over,
Nice cover.
you know, just to
Yeah.
hide
Nice cover.
the text. So how are you?
I'm good, I'm good.
There's a VGA cable.
And Elizabeth and Danny?
Yeah.
For the video,
Working on another book.
Yeah. On the right. This is on my laptop. I'll do it from this one. Up and running.
Good day job. I invited you to come, Max. He's a good help.
Maybe,
Yeah, patience good.
you know,
Yeah. Normally these things are mandatory for students. It was on the moon. Which is good.
other people,
Other people. That's it. But we have another room with a lot.
they are preparing the stove.
Come on, back.
Yeah.
I'll be there in a sec.
No, I don't think so. No. So did you fly all the way from London?
Yes.
Wow. How was the flight?
The flight was, I arrived on Thursday just as the snow was coming.
Oh my God, that's the worst day. of the
And
summer, right?
yeah, it was terrible. So we were held in the air for about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And then my taxi from JFK to Grand Central, 4 hours.
And then for an hour and a half, you're just circling, waiting.
Hour and a half
for the-
circling, and then 4 hours in a taxi.
After like a 8-hour flight or something, that's.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Brutal. I hope that your trip got easier.
It was fine after that.
Yeah, only up from there.
We can use,
One of those nicer. We don't get.
do you want to put those two up here?
Right? I think there is. Add some color to the walls.
Yeah, I think
I
that's
love
what
when
they're.
there's work
looking for like, we're doing like,
I wanted to tell you that I'm really into your project. Your business project, yeah. Definitely ambitious and it's really important.
I signed up for something.
Yeah. There's so many intermingling topics too with that.
Yeah, you really have to make someone call me.
I know. It's also like deforestation. Like there's so many things meeting in that area you're talking about. And I think those kind of topics are so interesting because like, you know, with your work you'll choose to highlight a certain area, but then when other people see it, they'll talk about all the different intersections. You don't have to pick one. Like you have to pick one, but like your work will not be only one. That's what I'm trying to say.
Amen.
Yeah, it's hard to do. Yeah. Yeah. Just keep it everywhere.
Hiya.
hi, how are you?
I'm fine.
I'm Seth.
Hi, Seth. How you doing?
Nice to meet you. Are you going out from here?
I was just going to transfer it to here if it was easier for you. It's a keynote. Does that have keynote?
It does have keynote.
Fine.
Do you have presentation notes?
No. I've learned it.
It's up to you.
I'm just doing it now.
All right, that's fine. You're all, yep, that's all good. So you're doing a presentation and then sitting
And
down.
then we're sitting down there with three of us. Yeah.
Right. So this
Yeah.
should pick you up. Fortunately, it doesn't, you might have to lean into it.
Sure, that's fine.
Do you have sound in your presentation?
No sound.
Awesome. I don't think I have any more questions.
It's very straightforward. Let me just see if it works.
Yes. Let's do that. That sounds good.
Hey, Seth,
Yes.
are you techie on Flash?
I can be.
Because I have a random, okay, well, I wish I already knew the answer to this. But when I do events, it's always very loud. So like the sound of the flash refreshing, is there a way to turn that off?
There's a way to turn off the beep, I think, in menu.
Because there's like, I'll do it so you can like hear it, what it does. Like that whole drawn out thing. Is that,
Yeah, this has to be a witch. Go into the menu of the.
I'm not used to quiet events, that's what I'm trying to say, and I'm like, I do some secondary stuff.
No, but actually it's a setting
In the flash?
in Flash itself. So I think that sounds.
It is, I think it is. So would that be?
What is this? Is this the system?
Yeah.
Hey there.
Hey, my friend. Very nice to see you.
You too.
How'd you make it?
I've been teasing Hannah all day long.
Have you? About what?
Coming here.
Oh.
Is this the scorched earth tour? Blake, you know how to change the.
No. Select venues.
It's right, it's right there. But I don't know how to get to it. That's how to, that's right there.
Change your life.
You what?
With it, I'm prepared to change your life with this.
Oh, we know.
Oh, we know.
I'm late changing your life.
How did it go? I'm sorry. You're good?
Beautiful.
All right, that's what I like to hear.
How was your day in Paris? Your day at top?
Very good.
It was tiring because I saw two
Sorry,
different
I
things
forgot
about
that.
No, it's great.
Oh,
No.
Lorelei. They were all very well.
Hi.
Good. She wanted to listen.
Yes.
I was, that's so
I mean,
good.
that was it. I know like to walk in like.
No, it was really good. No, it was
Looked
really good.
yesterday, and she was like.
Yes. She did well.
We've never met.
Unless
I only looked at her. You know, I didn't only suggest her, I suggested other women. But I singled her out because I thought she might have a combination of perhaps what you do. I mean, you guys got her at all.
That's fine.
Well, I think we lost. What about the cat? What about the cat cover?
That is interesting.
Yeah, did you see that cover? That was a really good
It's a 600, one is like standard.
You do other businesses?
Hey, thank you so much. Oh, you're welcome. Now I'm just trying to
You know,
Yeah, there's a way of doing it. See, it's right there. Right there. Here, do a quick here.
Yeah, looks like I can find my phone.
Oh, wait a minute. Okay, yeah, right.
We have, the toy hunt.
Great. We dress serious. Engaged. I know, I heard.
This,
I told her, like, you guys are going to realize, like, the man, and she was like, she's, no, so much, right? Like, not interested in terms of logistics. Yeah, I know.
no, we don't.
They use Japanese, those in the Asian context, because in Japanese, German, yeah, I used to go to Turkey, instead of, yeah, I went to Upset, yeah, I went to those guys. But I realized that they're very accommodating. I don't know how accommodating it is. It's just very accommodating trying to do these things. So one aspect. Also, the same time, I'm passionate for gender. Just that I say, there's something here that we need to expand it now. That's separate. That's not shitty, but maybe develop it. Yeah, so why I thought they could be sources for the thing and it was referenced.
That's
Never
it.
accepted. So I'm trying to get some. Yeah, okay. Right. Yeah.
The peanut butter. You will grab the same water.
And they're all coming
Oh, yeah. That's smart.
Todd's book. Todd's book was so good. I was so happy to open it up. Gorgeous book. It's one of those things when you just freaked out. So used to get more something so and it is
I got that idea from
extraneous, and it was really thrilled to be part of it. So my report on the book is really the boat comes in. It's like a ship to get here.
No, I know some of the shares.
All that. I went to the same show.
He said they have a design, yeah. Yeah, you should explain my here. Yeah, he's up on.
No.
Is that a campus? No, for the students, not for the students, but just in terms of, yeah, resources. Yeah. So everyone's hoping that money's coming in.
Yeah, it's always.
And what's the math?
Makes me know how much
That's a lot.
Yeah, the way they.
Did you figure it out? Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, a lot. That's a way. Yeah. Yeah, you can say it. Yeah, no, I didn't want to. I don't want to. No, with his wife.
Hello, how is Paris?
Set up something as
You know what I'm gonna say?
really good.
But in Europe. Something happens to me now.
It's like close to the live stream for Super.
No, you're good.
So, great.
We can. You brought it? I did actually, I did sleep, and then this is one of those. Go for it.
It's like a go, it's a go to math. Yeah.
You don't, but it's awesome.
It's pretty great. I was super excited.
I want to be in.
I sit right here.
Okay, great. That's great, thank you. No, but of course.
Charlie's gonna do like.
He wants that. I don't know.
Hello, 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 hello. I'm Charles Trout. Most of you know me. I know a lot of you, students, friends, colleagues, teachers, photographers, image makers, whatever, publishers, writers. I forgot those people, the writers. There's some writers here who are also photographers. This is one of our many lectures throughout the year, and this happens to be a book signing for David Campany's new book, which I'm holding up, published by Contrasto. And we were debating how to do this, and we said, well, how do you talk about a book that's about talking? Kind of a problematic. So David's going to make a small or a large presentation, or his own presentation of his current activity. And then we are going to interlock with him, Adam Bell, who is my colleague here, a writer in his own right, a wonderful photographer and teacher, and the co-author of 2 books that we call Readers, The Education of a Photographer and Vision Anew. And so we are experienced with this format. We want to make this, as David Campany says in his back page, whether long or short, nearly all these conversations were open-ended. For me, that is always the real value of a conversation. And we hope that that's what will happen here tonight, that we can engage you all in a conversation. Adam will tell you more about the subject matter in addition to David's book, his career, and his life. I merely want to say one thing. I first came in contact with David through the fact that my colleague Graham Weinbrenn and I decided we needed to do a course about the relationship of the still and the moving image. And we were looking for the ideal textbook. Well, guess what? This is over 10 years ago, I think. And it is kind of the Bible of this concern, certainly here. It's a very popular course of which this is the key text. And we thank you for it because it gave us all that we needed to form a course, and we didn't have to do any work. So that was really quite wonderful. I'll talk more about David after.
Good evening. Thanks everyone for coming. I just wanted to give a quick intro and tell you a little bit about David for those of you who are maybe less familiar with all the books and exhibitions that David has worked on. David Campany is a writer, curator, and artist currently based in London. His many, many books include the one that Charlie was just showing and you all are here for, as well as A Handful of Dust, The Open Road, Photography and the American Road Trip, Walker Evans, The Magazine Work, Gasoline, Jeff Wall, Pictures for Women, Photography and Cinema, The Cinematic, Art and Photography. And he has written over 200 essays for catalogs and monographs for artists and museums, as well as writing articles for magazines such as Aperture, Frieze, Source, and the Tate magazine. Among the many curatorial projects he's worked on include the recent The Still Point and the Turning World between film and photography, The Open Road, Photography and the American Road Trip, A Handful of Dust, Walker Evans Magazine Work, Louis Balt's Common Objects, Victor Bergen, A Sense of Place, Mark Neville, Deeds Not Words, and Anonymise, Unnamed America in Photography and Film. He's also the recipient of the ICP Infinity Award for his writing, as well as the Krasna Kraus Book Award, which I hope I'm not butchering that. And he currently teaches at the University of Westminster in London. So it's a great pleasure to have David here tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Great.
Yeah.
Charles and Adam, thanks for the sterling introduction. I want to meet that guy. when people read out bios, it all sounds so monolithic. You know, inside you're just a bunch of doubts and curiosities, really. So it's quite alienating to hear that listed. No, also if you stick around long enough, you kind of build up a body of work. But that was never a great intention of mine. All I wanted to do was be with images, really. It's nice that you held up that book, Charles. That's photography and cinema. It's probably one of my favorites. It's interesting that you use it for your course, because most of my writing is done not really for undergrads, but it's done for me at that age. I could have really come cropper. I could have really fallen off the side, and very good writing about photography and cinema really saved me. So I was kind of paying a debt back, and I was trying to write that book for me at around 18 or 19 years of age. It's not a model for every writer, but I try and keep that in mind. Before we get going, I've just come from Aperture, and Aperture's new issue of the Photo Book Review is out. And Leslie Martin, the editor-in-chief, tells me it's quite hard to get hold of this unless you subscribe to the magazine. So I edited it, and it's about editing. It's about the editing of images, and there's a stack of them over there. You can take them as you go. Okay, the latest book, which is published by Contrasto, to whom I'm very grateful, is called So Present, So Invisible, Conversations on Photography. And I get asked to write quite a lot by photographers. And every once in a while, it crosses my mind that nothing's crossed my mind, actually, and that I would rather talk with the photographers or artists. And this interesting thing about that whole question of talking about images, you don't know whether a photographer is going to be remotely interesting or articulate about their work. It seems to me there's no correspondence between the work and the possibility that the person behind it might be able to articulate it in ways other than the making of the images. But it's usually a hunch I follow. If I don't have anything interesting to say and I'm interested in their work, I'll suggest a conversation. And it is always a conversation. I don't like interviews, and I certainly don't like questionnaires. An open-ended conversation is a rare thing these days because everything gets quite formatted. And publishers often want something quite scripted in advance, so they know exactly what the word length is going to be and what's going to be covered. And I can't do that in a conversation. It's got to wander. And this is really a book of wanderings. Some of them are very short. Some of them are long. Some of them were conducted face to face. Some of them were done by email. Some of them were done over the telephone. One of them was done wandering around London between the hours of 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., which I'll come to. But they were all open-ended, and they were done over the last maybe 15, 16 years. And so this book was a chance to bring them all together. People like talking about photography. I haven't quite got to the bottom of precisely why that is. I think if you put on a symposium around sculpture, it's not going to be as enthusiastically attended, I get the impression, as a symposium about photography. And I don't know what it is about photography exactly that people like talking about. And part of the impulse for me for putting the book together was to try and find out something about that. I didn't find anything out about that, to be honest. I'm still not entirely sure why. I mean, there are sort of official reasons, sort of good pedagogical reasons why photography should be talked about, because it's powerful. Socially, it's powerful, because it's so ubiquitous and so manipulative.
Psychologically, it's powerful because we don't really know the effects that images are having on us most of the time. And aesthetically, it can be very powerful. It's mute, obviously, so it can be talked over quite easily. And it's enigmatic, or at least I find photography to be enigmatic. And that's probably because, you know, what does a photograph do? It's a registering of the light bouncing off the surface of the world, put it its simplest, I suppose. And that means that photography is quite good at the what, but it's not very good at the why or the how. And that might be why photography grew up quite closely with language, not just talking about it, but words on the page next to images. That might be one of the reasons that it gets talked about. But I'm still not sure what we talk about when we talk about photography. Lots of photographers like to talk around it and don't talk about it directly, like it's a kind of golden secret at the heart of what they do. I usually like to ask photographers why photography, rather than anything else that they might be interested in, and I usually get blank faces, as if that's, you know, the kind of founding question that can't be answered directly, that motivates everything else, animates everything else. I'm not sure, and neither are these two, you know, Raymond Carver or Haruki Murakami. Carver, who wrote What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, that somehow when you think you're talking about something, you might be talking about something else. And Murakami's What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. So there's a lot of displacement that goes on when you talk about photography. I was very aware of this, and I was trying to get all of the people I was talking to not to do that, to try as best as possible to stick to the topic and not wander too much. I think the great text for not wandering is Fox Talbot's The Pencil of Nature. Not the first book, photographic book. For me, it's the first interesting one. Sorry, Joshua. Joshua's from the New York Public Library, and he's just curated a big show about Anna Atkins and her Book of Cyanotypes, which is the first book. Anyway, doesn't have much writing in it. We'll come to it in a sec. Fox Talbot writes this book really as a prospectus of what the medium might become. And that's a peculiar thing to have to do. Imagine photography exists and nobody knows what it's for yet. And Talbot writes a very, very beautiful, very sophisticated and prescient book about this. And it's a familiar format, a photograph on one page and a text on another. In fact, there are 24, each with its own text, and they are all speculations about what photography could be. But at the same time, it strikes me, Fox Talbot is demonstrating what happens when words and images play together on the page. I love this little text. From the specimen here given, this image is called Articles of China. I think it's the third plate in the book. From the specimen here given, it's sufficiently manifest that the whole cabinet of a virtuoso and collector of old china might be depicted on paper in little more time than it would take to make a written inventory describing it in the usual way. That's a nice first sentence, despite the florid Victoriana of its construction. He's already setting up something interesting about how photographs describe the world and how words describe the world. But at the same time, he's having his cake and eating it. He's got words on a page and he's got a picture on the page. The more strange and fantastic the forms of his old teapots, the more advantage in having their pictures given instead of their descriptions. And should a thief afterwards purloin the treasures, they were Talbot's own treasures, as it happens. If the mute testimony of the picture were to be produced against him in court, it would certainly be evidence of a novel kind. And that expression, evidence of a novel kind of stuck in the phrase book of photography. There's been a number of books published called Evidence of a Novel Kind and a number of exhibitions over the years. But I've always loved the fact that right from the beginnings, word and image came into this very animated, dynamic relationship. There's the Atkins book. There you are, Joshua. I'm not being so rude. Atkins's text is much shorter. There's a book that was, its first volume appeared slightly before Talbot's. But it's interesting that Atkins did want to write something, not very much. Kind of just a very simple outlaying text of what she was up to. Although it still strikes me as being very mysterious what she was up to, making hundreds and hundreds of pictures of algae, which might be scientific or might be something else. I've always loved this. So it's, as far as I know, it's the first photographically illustrated conversation. And it's taking place between Paul Nadar, the famous Nadar's son, the photographer Nadar's son, and a very famous chemist called Chevreuil. And it ran over several pages of the French Le Journal Illustré. And it's a kind of sequence, almost a sort of cinematic sequence. And you follow over the pages as their ideas develop while you're looking at them. I don't know how it was recorded or if it was recorded. But it makes for a beautifully satisfying 6 or 7 pages. Now, what is it about conversations? I recalled when I was an undergraduate, I was a sort of theory head, you know, just reading lots of critical theory and philosophy, which I found difficult. I didn't mind the difficulty. I like getting out of my depth, but boy, did I lose a lot of night's sleep trying to work out what Derrida was talking about, or Barthes, until I turned to conversations with them, you know, books of conversations, or maybe a journal would carry a conversation with a thinker. And that's what opened those ideas up to me, because there's something about reading a conversation between two people that is not, that's quite freeing as a reader. You don't feel addressed. You feel you're eavesdropping on two people talking with each other. Of course, it's a rhetorical trick. It's still words on the page. But if it works, it works. And I've always been a kind of avid fan of the conversation as a literary and discursive form, just because of that idea of opening up a book and not being addressed, but being allowed to, I was going to say listen in, but could you say read in the way you would say listen in? Could you read in? Feels like that. Anyway, all I want to do over the next sort of 10, 15 minutes is just to kind of clue you into the different tones of conversation that are in the book. I mentioned that one of them was done while walking around London in the middle of the night. There's a wonderful photographer, German, although she's lived in London most of her adult life, called Ruth Blies Luxemburg. And she makes pictures almost exclusively at night. And I wanted to know how she did it. She's a deep thinker about images. She's kind of soaked in a kind of German philosophical tradition. And she said, sure, but you'll have to come with me. So we set off. I carried her tripod. We met at midnight. And we visited the locations of various photographs that she'd made around London. And she brought with her a little set of 35mm slides, which she put in a little kind of light box. And every time we got to the location where she'd taken one of her photographs, we got to look at a slide of the final image that she'd made of it while staring at what she'd shot. So it was a very nice way of thinking about, how a photograph transforms a scene, especially in her work, because her exposures are often 20, 25 minutes. Where it says DC, it's me. DC, it's Saturday night and we're at the foot of Hungerford Bridge in central London. Root, you're preparing an image of the underside of the bridge. You've made a 35mm study, which we have here. So we can see the image in the bridge itself. Was there an obvious way for you to make an image of this? By that I mean, do places strike you as images? Well, I won't do the accent, although she has a fabulous accent. Well, this study already has a title, which is De Ziende Tiefe. It took me a while to figure out the title, which means the wandering depth. And Ziende also means pulling. So there's this play between wandering and pulling, and that's exactly what I felt about the water here. It sort of pulls you as well as moving you along. And with this long light exposure, you suddenly see something below the surface, and that is what I was interested in here. So yes, there was an obvious way for me to shoot the scene. Photographs have a very odd way of covering their tracks in terms of intention or motivation. And the intention of an image is not its meaning. I'm French enough in my education to think that the meaning of a work lies with the audience, not with the maker of the image. And so what a maker has to say about their making of the image is interesting to me, but it's not the gospel. I'm interested in what photographers have to say about the making of their images because of this fact that they cover their tracks very often. You can't really figure out what may have motivated it or how it might have been made. So that's interesting, but it only ever adds to the mix. I'm not interested, don't think anyone should be interested in defaulting to what a photographer says about their work. It's just part of the mix. I was asked to write a kind of career spanning, can't say that because he's still alive, you can't, let's say the first 50 years of Stephen Shaw's working life, for a big book, big retrospective book. And I noticed that every time I read an interview with him, he said the same things. So I thought, I don't want to write, but let's have a conversation. So he came to London, he came to my house, we sat down and I said, Stephen, every time I read an interview with you, you say the same thing. And he said, don't ask me the same questions. So what we had was a kind of conversation that avoided every obvious question that Stephen Shaw has ever been asked. And it was great. We were thoroughly satisfied with it. The publisher wanted, I think, 3,000 words, and it was 19,500 words. And we both went to the publisher with our tail between our legs, having to say, look, it's really good. We're really pleased with it. Stephen has taught for a long time. He's taught since 1982. And there is something I have noticed about photographers who have taught. They've had to formulate things, and they've had to formulate them quite clearly, even quite complex ideas quite clearly. And there might be in the book a kind of bias towards photographers who have taught. That's something I noticed only afterwards. And Stephen is as precise in his words as he is in his images, but I have issues with the way, with what he's being precise about. And I was constantly trying to sort of prod him about this. And he often talks about the photograph being illusionistic. It's very difficult to look at a photograph and not feel that it's on some level a three-dimensional space. Obviously, it's never a total illusion. No one ever feels they're going to fall into a photograph like it's a rectangular hole. And yet photographs perceptually are not completely flat either. And I know this is something that has preoccupied Stephen. He says at one point, Every now and again, you see a photograph where the illusion of three-dimensionality is really strong. In the 70s, I tried to work on it structurally. How does one little compositional detail, perhaps a post or a curb meeting the edge of the frame or a telegraph pole, how do these things change the perception of space? And I said, the strange thing about the illusion of transparency is that the more successful it is, the more disarming it is, which leads the viewer to reflect upon the illusion, and thus it ceases being an illusion. I have this feeling really strongly when I look at your picture of the green car, which is called Natural Bridge, New York, July 31st, 1974. It's the most illusory photograph I've ever seen, and it is. I've looked at this photograph for years. It's very, very difficult to imagine it just being a flat, two-dimensional picture. It's quite unnerving, but that feeling produces an attention, a scrutiny of the image that undercuts the illusion. I'm brought up to its surface as a flat picture. It's too good. Are you saying you can't win? Says Stephen. Yes. The more successful the illusion, Stephen says, the more you are aware of it being an illusion. And as he said that, I saw this kind of eureka look on his face. And I thought, I've solved something for Stephen about this that's gone on over the years. And all the conversations, I'm sort of aiming for that kind of interaction. I'm not trying to pick someone apart, but I am trying to pick away maybe at some of the presumptions about how they think to get somewhere else. And Stephen is a very generous thinker. In fact, he doesn't do interviews or conversations anymore. He points everyone to this one that we did, which is quite flattering. That's the image. It's a peculiar picture. Can't quite get to the bottom of how that illusionism happens in this one in particular, but there we go. Some of the conversations have been at my instigation. Most of what I do is by invitation, and I like that because an invitation is quite random. You don't know when you open your email inbox what you might get asked to do. That's energizing for me. But I had always wanted to meet Susan Marsalis, a very interesting photographer, belongs to the Magnum agency, as you probably know, lives here in New York on Mott Street. And I'd never met her. I had just admired her work from afar. And I pleaded with someone to give me her phone number, and I just phoned her up. I said, you've no idea who I am, but I know who you are, and I'm a big admirer. Can I come and talk to you? And she's very generous. And we sat down and we hit it off immediately. And she said, wow, we're talking about interesting things. Someone should be recording this. At which point I brought out of my pocket my little dictaphone and said, well, can we? I had no thought of publishing it at that time. Just recording it for me. And I got very interested in the fact that she has a very complicated relation to her own work. And it comes from joining an agency. You know, she got invited to join Magnum when she was quite young. And she was decided to go to Nicaragua to cover the sort of uprising there in 1979, and she was sending her images back to the agency, who were then syndicating them out around the world. And it was only when she got back from Nicaragua, which was a long time after most of the journalists had left, that she saw how the world's media had used her pictures, used and misused. But then she started folding that into her own work. So she would make exhibitions about how her own work had been used. I remember thinking, yeah, why are they called photo agencies when agency is the one thing the photographer loses? Join an agency, lose your agency. But Susan has hung in there in Magnum for many years. Anyway, and she's very interested in the fact that a photograph can get used and misused and recontextualized and maybe has a life of its own. And that's really the subject of this conversation. Photographs persist, I said. They hang around to be reused in other ways. So the challenge is twofold: to try and look again at the ephemeral printed matter that has been the basis of visual culture for over a century now, and to track the careers of photographic images across time through that ephemeral culture. I've worked on a number of projects where I've been tracking the careers of images, but I tend to do it as a writer. And Susan replied, I can do that, but not as a writer, thinker. If I were, I'd be writing the kinds of important texts Alan Sekula has been writing. I approach it in primarily visual ways. My method is to say, let's put it up or out there and think about it. And I think that's what attracted me in the first place to Mercedes, that she seemed to be doing as a practitioner what a lot of writers were doing in their writings, just thinking about how images get used and reused. Anyway, Victor Bergin was always a big influence on me, I think because he was is an image maker and a writer and a teacher, and is constantly pushing boundaries. Victor says at one point, having spent 18 months learning how to use 3D software programs, I'm only just now getting to the point where I'm feeling I know enough to actually use them. What you're looking at there is a CGI representation of a coffee house in Istanbul, which was built as a kind of modernist utopian space for kind of free thinkers. And the building was destroyed by the Sofitel hotel chain. And the coffee house was reconstructed on another site as a kind of Orientalist theme restaurant. And Victor taught himself computer programming so he could reimagine something that he wasn't able to photograph because it had been destroyed. He's trying to kind of recapture a kind of utopian moment in Turkish history between the Ottoman Empire and kind of global capital. It was an interesting few decades when things could have been great. And for him, that space was an embodiment of it. Now, I'm not being ageist here, but Victor is well into his 70s. And he spent 18 months learning 3D software. So I said, these programs are extremely complex. Why not work with specialists? And Victor said, I trained as a painter, and I'm very aware that a lot of what happens in painting comes out of a struggle with the medium, good old-fashioned Greenbergian expression there, struggle with the medium. It will never quite do what you want or expect. Later, using photography was a struggle, and I always found the dialectic between what you think you want to do and what the medium will let you do is an aspect that keeps things alive. That's not to say the result is going to be any more or less appealing or interesting to an audience. Now, if somebody works in the directorial mode with assistants and technicians, and I jumped in and said, they're not struggling with the medium, they're not benefiting from the dialectic. I did a tour of the Chelsea galleries this weekend, and you can see that the same technicians work for most of the artists. And if it's not the same technicians, they've definitely got the same attitude to what they're doing. And that kind of standardization is a worry in the arts. And I love the idea that Victor taught himself, this is an industrial strength program. It's what they use on, Lord of the Rings to generate Gandalf's beard or whatever. And he took the time to do it. And his work doesn't look like anyone else's work when you see the whole thing. That's an artist really thinking about their medium carefully. Did a conversation with LaToya Ruby Fraser. We'd crossed paths a couple of times, and she was just about to publish her book, The Notion of Family. And I was really fascinated with how she'd managed to make her own bridge between obviously what she'd kind of picked up in her kind of art and photo education that came from a kind of experimental documentary tradition and new approaches. And turned out we were both fond of a text that Bertolt Brecht had written in the 30s about realism and literature, where he says you can't rely on, there's no conventions for realism. If the world around you is changing all the time, you've got to change with it. There's no fixed style, there's no fixed mode. Experimentation is a necessity. And this is a big part of how Latoya works, that she's a necessary experimenter. And it's really a discussion around that. But I should say something about the context. She was not so well known at the time. I think the notion of family had just been published, but it hadn't exploded. And there was a sudden moment where people realized that she was a very interesting, important artist. And I went out of my way because I saw an early PDF of the book and I thought it was extraordinary. And I went out of my way to try and get a platform for her. So I contacted Freeze magazine. And it's really the only one in the book where there was a very fixed structure, partly coming from the magazine, which said you've only got 3,000 words. And also for me, because I wanted it to be just a platform for her to lay out how she thinks about what she does. And it worked out. I don't need to read what's on the screen there, but that's an exception in the book, that it did have a very structured basis. There's a conversation with Lucas Blaylock, who's a very sophisticated thinker, and he's a sort of metaphor machine. Whenever you talk to him, you can see his kind of mind working, and he'll try and explain to himself and to others what he's doing in terms of metaphors. And he makes all kinds of images. I guess he's best known for kind of still life constructions, and then he'll use Photoshop in a kind of deliberately gauche or awkward way, not the kind of slick way of the commercial still life. Anyway, I have put this idea out there before, that early jazz audiences not only had familiarity with the standard tunes, but having come up in a culture where it was expected you could play an instrument or carry a tune, that the technical variations were also widely legible. If you played a tune in 5/4, your audience could hear it. And I think photography is in a similar cultural situation now. Not only do a broad range of people understand the camera, but also increasingly the tools of the picture's digital processing. Imagining and attempting to re-articulate this ground, putting pressure on these expectations, especially your own, is a big part of what it means to make pictures. I was quite taken by that. And we were having this exchange by email. And so you're not having to respond in the moment. You can think about it a bit. And he caught me with this jazz thing, and I had to really think about it carefully. So a couple of days went by before I replied to him. And I said, improvising with materials before the camera is a kind of photographic jazz people understand. That's nice. But improvising with Photoshop seems to be a different matter. Photoshop hasn't reached the jazz phase for most people. They use it to standardize, to perfect, a kind of grooming of the image. You don't take that path at all. You take the same attitude to Photoshop as you take to what you do in front of the camera. It's experimental. It is, he replied about 10 seconds later. Grooming is a great way to describe Photoshop's more conventional use. It's nice. So he got me thinking metaphorically too. And the exchange we had is really an exchange of metaphors for different photographic procedures. I'm mindful of the fact that photographs clearly cannot be reduced to language, although people like talking about them a lot. And words accompany images a lot. And they're right from the beginning, as we saw with Talbot, there have been very interesting figures who have pursued word and image side by side. Some of them are in the room tonight, I know. This isn't in the book, but it might be an interesting counterpoint to what is in the book. About 18 months ago, I was asked by an artist who I'd never met if I wanted to have a conversation about photography, and I was editing the book at the time. Sure, let's do it. What do you want to talk about? And she said, well, I want to do it in images. Let's have the conversation in images, kind of wordless. How are we going to do that? And she said, well, we were both on Instagram. And she said, well, you like my pictures and I like your pictures. So let's do it like that. So she set up a separate Instagram and she said, I'll upload an image and you can upload an image in response, and then we'll just go back and forth, and that will be the conversation. The photographs will be in conversation with each other, not us. Well, it's still going on, and we have met, but for months we hadn't. But along the way, I think we were about a month into this project, she sent me a really fascinating text by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Does anyone still read Oliver Wendell Holmes? Please put your hand. Somebody, yes. Thank you, sir. Very interesting 19th century essayist. 1863, published in the Atlantic Monthly, an essay called Doings of the Sunbeam, most of which is taken up with a tedious, no, I shouldn't say tedious because you might be interested in it, a thorough account of commercial daguerreotype studios in America. If you're a kind of photo historian, you'll know that there was a kind of craze for commercial daguerreotypes studios. You could go and get your portrait made, photographic portrait made. After 15 pages of this, Oliver Wendell Holmes has earned himself the right to speculate. It's an essay, after all. An essay comes from the French essayer, which means to try. So you should always be trying something in an essay. A photographic intimacy between two persons who never saw each other's faces, that is, in nature's original positive, the principle of which, after all, is to furnish negatives from which portraits may be taken, is a new form of friendship. A photographic intimacy between two persons who never saw each other's faces is a new form of friendship. After an introduction by means of a few views of scenery or other impersonal objects with a letter or two of explanation, the artist sends his own presentment, not in the stiff shape of a purchased carte de visite, but as seen in his own study or parlor, surrounded by the domestic accidents which so add to the individuality of the student or the artist. He goes on to describe. But the principle is interesting. You know, he's 1863. You know, photography's only barely been around a couple of decades. And here's Oliver Wendell Holmes, one, imagining a conversation taking place entirely in photographic form and across continents. That's a prediction of social media in 1863. Quite remarkable in a way. But also it's interesting in the sense that he's imagining that photographs could carry on their own dialogue, wouldn't necessarily have to be relayed through words. And so I was sent that while we were having this photographic conversation. You can follow us on Instagram if you like. And I want to end there, but so there's something on the screen. I just put together a little video version of what happens on that Instagram feed where images are conversing with each other while I converse with Adam and Charles. Thank you very much.
This on? Yeah. I don't know if I want to talk or I want to look at these images.
No.
But
We're facing
we'll
that way.
find
You
that.
can. We'll ignore
I
them.
happen to know the artist
Oh
who
yes,
I
you
met
do.
separately, and she told me about this dialogue they were having. And I was following both of them independently. And actually, I've never followed this because I didn't know how to follow it, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
So knowing both of them, I know how complicated and wonderful and magical this really is, and I can't wait to actually do it.
It's.
Get into it.
I don't know what's in it for her. It was a relief from words for me. I spend all day with words.
I suspect that for her, knowing her, and she works in many different ways, but makes a kind of collage, whether she finds it in the real world or in the studio, that it's a means of just spontaneously reacting to the environment that she's in. And as a photographer myself, I find Instagram very freeing that way. You don't have any preconceptions, and you try to do away with them and just respond. Which is what conversation is about, I think.
Yeah.
I just want to say a few things. In reading David, looking at my notes in this book again this morning, and other things I've read about him, and I have to say I'm very honored that he wrote something about my work for my recent book. And reading this and other essays, I find uniquely that David is trying to find out what photography is about and what photographs have to say. I'm paraphrasing you a little bit. And not trying to will on it a theory or a possibility of his own, but rather trying, as a photographer does, or at least as those of us who wander and collect, find out what has been said and what is being said. And on top of it, he has read it all, and he's looked at a tremendous amount of it. I'm astounded, actually, with his ability to really investigate the past and the present and now the future. And I just want to take you back to a proposition that we have here. We're calling this department, which was once called Photography, Video, and Related Media. That's still our official name, and we started that way in 1988 before others were thinking about that. But we've kind of have a subphrase, lens and screen arts. We don't separate them, or at least we try not to, though people do practice in the straight photographic manner and the digital manner or analog, but also many people cross over and are involved in all kinds of mixed and transformative media. And I'm wondering how you feel about that practice, because these are primarily, basically photographers. And the medium has morphed a great deal. And we also here try to have no bias or no ideology about what's right way to make a photograph or right way to make a video. And so I wonder what you have to say about it.
Well, it's interesting. My first cultural love was cinema, and sort of growing up late 70s, early 80s, British television, terrestrial television, only had 4 channels, but boy, did they show great movies. And by the time I was maybe 15, 16, I'd seen most of Godard and Ozu and Fellini and Hitchcock and Renoir and Bresson. And this was kind of before video even. So to find out more about films, you had to look at books. And the first photographs I really liked were stills from films, interestingly. And I was looking again at Beaumont Newell's first attempt to make a history of photography, 1937. The medium's already a century old at that point. And it includes cinema, rightly. It includes cinema. After the Second World War, cinema wants to have its own history, and photography drops it. and most books on the history of photography don't include cinema anymore. And I always thought that was a real absence. I was watching this brilliant video recording, very crackly black and white video recording of Walker Evans giving a lecture to Gary Winogrand's students in 1974. And one of the students says to Evans, do you still go to the movies? Because during the war he wrote, there was no photography to do and he didn't fight in the war. He wrote art and film reviews for Time magazine. And Walker immediately, you know, pricks up and he says, yeah, I can still go to the movies. The student said, what have you seen lately? And he says, well, I've seen 2 movies by Robert Altman, McCabe and Mrs. Miller and The Long Goodbye. He says, I don't know if they were shot by the same person. They were actually, they were both shot by Vilmos Zsigmond. And then he goes really quiet and he says, it's such a good phrase. He said, those movies, they are a marvelous bunch of photography. And I thought that's such a good way for a photographer to describe a movie as a marvelous bunch of photography. And it's online. You can find this online. And I sent a link of it to Jeff Wall. And there's a conversation between Jeff Wall and I in the book. But this happened just after the book was published. I sent this link because I know he's a big Evans fan. And 2 days go by and then I get a 1,500 word email back saying, I would never have thought in my wildest dreams that Evans would have said about, you know, a film that it's a marvelous bunch of photography, but he understood it. Of course it is. Of course it is. And everything you do to make a film could be applied to photography, which is, of course, the path that.
I have a coda to that.
Yeah.
I met Vilmos Zsigmond at a dinner party.
Wow.
He didn't know me. I didn't know him. I knew who he was.
Yeah.
Certainly, I was a young man. And I was introduced as a photographer, and he said, everything I learned about film, I learned from Walker Evans and Andre Curtis.
Genius. Well, you see, there's nothing to stop. Of course,
you have to study still.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, of course the arts are going to talk to each other. I suppose photography's problem was in order to be taken seriously as an art, it took up too strongly the idea that it had to be a distinct art, and it cut itself off for too long. Of course, it's going to have overlaps with theatre and literature and sculpture and performance and the moving image, but of course it's going to have its own characteristics too. And I think that has really expanded the conversation, to use the word of the evening, around photography.
Why do you think, because one thing that Charlie and I were noticing in the book is a lot of the photographers spend a lot of time sort of grappling with and trying to justify why photography.
Yeah.
And why is that still an issue at this day and age?
Because I think it's really perplexing. It is a very perplexing medium. And maybe if it wasn't, people wouldn't be so strung up about it, and people would have moved on. I mean, I'm always surprised in a way that photography didn't just die like a lot of those other weird 19th century inventions of that period. It's still with us, presumably because it's generous and it's expansive, and it has no fixed relation to time. It has no fixed relation to space. It has no fixed relation to description. And, you know, if Talbot was here now, he wouldn't be remotely surprised about what happened to photography. He did seem to understand that. That's really, I'd love to have had a conversation with him. But yeah, they are all circling around the question of what it is. I don't know if that comes from me leading them down those paths. It might do. It might come from that.
And there's also seems to be a distinction between talking about photographs and talking about photography, which is something you brought up in our conversation before tonight. And I was wondering what you see that distinction as being and how you see that maybe playing out in some of the conversations that you had.
Yeah, it's true. I think, generally speaking, contemporary discussion can be split between a kind of thinking that comes out of looking at specific images or specific bodies of work or specific projects, and something kind of much more global than that, where there are certain writers and thinkers who won't let an image get in the way of their theory of photography in general. And I've always been suspicious about that. I think because I'm too fascinated with images. So I try to work from the particular outwards. I think if you've got a theory, there's enough variation in the photographs out there for you to pick an example that will fit your theory. It's harder to work the other way around and just say, let's look at this and think about what it is and how it communicates and how it affects us. That's much harder than just having a theory and applying it. I understand that, and there are benefits. There are benefits from thinking about photography away from photographs. Don't get me wrong, but there are limits, and photography is often a kind of bad object for a lot of thinkers. And this probably, the best-selling book on photography is called On Photography, and it doesn't have any images in it, and it's written by someone who doesn't like it very much. I love the fact that she didn't like it very much. And I did put it to her. I met her as an undergrad, and she said, yeah, you're right. I wasn't very good at engaging with specific images. It seems like that's a very different skill set. She didn't say skill set. Sorry, that's not a Sontag word. She said that's a very different, requires a different acumen or something like that.
To go back to the question that Adam's raising, it just seemed to me, and I sense it in some, I can't be specific in the readings in the book. When I came into the medium, photography was in the basement, literally and figuratively, in either the art school or certainly in the museum, or maybe it was in some back room on the top floor that you couldn't get to. And of course, now we're on the first floor, and everywhere. And photography is the matrix in some way for almost all of our dialogue or conversation, whether in science or medicine or some kind of, let's say, lens imagery. And yet we still seem to be defensive about it, in some way trying to justify why we do it, whether it's an art form even, which we would think, And I know a lot of artists who use photography, they don't call themselves photographer. They deliberately, I'm an artist, I don't do photography.
Yeah.
And I think that it's time we got over that in a way. And
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think you have to be careful what you wish for. Let's say tomorrow photography just arrived and it was no longer in the basement. It was on the top floor. It was in the penthouse. And everybody loved it and accepted it. That would be bad because it would be dead at that point. There is something in photography which will always drag it into the basement. And that's because it's always haunted by its non-art uses and functions. And that's energized the conversation for a long time. It's also blocked it at certain points where photographers were too anxious and too kind of prepossessing about their claims for the artistic status of photography, and were sort of unwilling to accept its kind of base character too. So I think even with the best will in the world, or the highest profile in the museums, or the highest prices at auction, or whatever, it will always be, it will always have one foot in the basement. And
you've made the kind of point where it was only once and you can correct this paraphrasing, that once photography was sort of at the point of obsolescence, that it it sort of came into its own, and it freed up artists to sort of experiment with it in a way.
Yeah, that's true. There's something about what happens with a medium when it's eclipsed, that it gets a new energy enters into it and it gets released. That certainly happened. If not to photography, then to people's perceptions of it. Photography was suddenly, we have seen an extraordinary rise in the last generation or so of the status and interest in photography, and that must be to do with its displacement. It's not an art argument. I think it's to do with its displacement as a mass medium. That the still silent image is suddenly thinkable because it's not the water we swim in anymore, really. I mean, if you're 18 or 19, I mean, I always ask my undergrads this. It's like, why have you chosen photography? No one would say 2018 is the year of photography. Would they? I don't think they would. I mean, it's still around, but it is eclipsed. It's not it doesn't carry the weight of the day. That would be video and digital streaming, and there's something quite quaint about the stillness and the silence of photography now. And that eclipse or displacement makes it thinkable, and it makes it talkable in a different kind of way, I think. But you don't agree, Charles? You feel?
No,
I mean, I know you're part of a generation that did fight very hard for it, but so it may be churlish of me to say it.
I've always championed
You need the mics. Posterity beckons.
I've always championed anything and any pursuit. As I said before, we have no one ideology in this department of where this medium can go. As a personal image maker, I am that quaint vehicle, interested in what I discover out there. But I think a younger generation, in which there are a number of people here from our students and others, they're really bombarded by all of the possibilities of what the lens can produce. And they're trying to figure it out in new forms and new relationships, because it's part of their experience every day. And many are not interested in the quaintness that, we'll use that term, but rather in the kaleidoscope of all of this activity. And sometimes people of my background, there are other faculties here, we can't quite figure it out. What's the theme? Or there's so many themes in it, and yet it's very real to this younger generation. And so I'm trying to explore what that means as a teacher and educator, and as a photographer. I could never learn as Victor Bergen did, that I have no adeptness at such things, and I leave it to them. So I don't disagree. In fact, I would like to see it the way it was, but I don't think it is exactly. I think the instantaneousness of Instagram, I love Instagram, by the way. A lot of people are exploring 3D imagery, all kinds of other technologies. We're 3D printing here, using photography as the base of making some object. It's all exploratory. We're still new to this medium,
Yeah, definitely, and it'll remain permanently new. I mean, I like Instagram because it can be a visual platform, but it's also quite an interesting image text platform. And then a lot of the people I like on Instagram are image makers and writers, or they're giving you images and writing about them. I notice if ever I write, it's liked more than if I just post pictures. Which makes me think there's some kind of hunger out there for ways of what signposts for ways to think about photography. Maybe not even write about it, but to think about it. I think the overwhelmingness that you talk about is it does. I can quite clearly see that it stifles people's ability to think about it. Because thinking always, it always takes time and it's difficult, and it means carving out a space to do it and finding a framework to talk about it with other people. And that's always against the odds, because we live in a visual culture that would rather you didn't think at all, just to put it bluntly. So there's always something subversive about thinking about photography.
As a writer and a photographer.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a challenge, since we're here at SVA and we have a lot of students in the audience and all three of us are teachers. Can you teach someone how to talk about photography? How do you teach someone how to talk about photography? I mean, so much of it seems like you just have to dive in and start doing it. That's part of what a lot of the class work or critique work is involved in, where you're learning to talk about your work, other people's work.
I think there are always certain kinds of writing that would be interesting to different kinds of students. I'm not very interested in the idea of a curriculum of thought. I think that's quite dangerous. I think I was attracted to photography where I was probably part of the last generation that could be attracted to it because it was a bit renegade. It's a bit like, what the hell is it doing in a university in the first place, And it still seemed a bit like the Wild West in terms of, what was an appropriate way to think about it. And then I noticed, probably over the period I've been teaching, that a kind of curriculum has congealed, really, and I think that's terribly unhelpful because young students associate thinking about photography with very particular ways of thinking about it, and I think that's pretty dangerous. As long as they're thinking, but
you said something great in a little piece you wrote for Hotchu, which is a website where photography about photography isn't even photography.
Yeah.
That was in response to a prompt, why do you hate photography? And
Yeah.
I thought it sort of gets at a little bit of what you're describing now, is what the motivations that obsess photographers, and what are motivations and obsessions that drive successful photographers, which may have nothing to do with the medium.
Yeah, well, it's not. I can give a couple of examples of this. Cautionary tales, really. I had a student came into my office and said, "Can you help me?" I said, "Sure." And she said, I've had a boyfriend for about 15 years, and he has one eye. He has a glass eye, artificial eye, and it's damaged, and he's got to go and have a new one made. And he's going to the best hospital in London, and I've got full access to it, and I can follow the whole thing. I thought, well, that's great. You're photographing someone you love. 2, you're in a completely new environment with this kind of special access. Great. I'd like to see what you come up with. And what do you want from me? And she said, well, are there any other photographers that you know of who have done projects about artificial eyes? And because that's how photographers are taught to research. But a big part of research in photography is your subject matter. There have been great photographers who have not thought about the medium very much at all. You don't have to. You really don't have to. You can do, but you don't have to. It might benefit you just to think about your subject matter and let your picture making come out of that. Just going back to the Stephen Shaw conversation, on the day that he came to my house to record it, he was due to come for lunch, and my brother-in-law was staying with me, and on the table was my copy of Uncommon Places, you know, the book of pictures that Stephen Shaw took on the road in the 70s, largely 8 by 10, beautifully descriptive photographs of kind of everyday scenes. And my brother-in-law is a mechanic, and he starts going through the book and he gets really absorbed in it, and it takes him about 20 minutes to go through the book, and he puts it down and sort of deep breath, and he said, he said, do you think there were a lot of MGB cars in America in the 70s? Because there are a lot in this book. Or do you think Stephen Shaw photographed them quite a lot? I said, well, he's coming for lunch. You can ask him. So we get to coffee, and my brother-in-law clears his throat, and he says, so, Mr. Shaw, I've been looking at your book, and it seems there are a lot of MGB cars. You know, were there a lot in America, or did you just photograph them a lot? And Stephen's eyes lit up. And he said, no photo person, pointing at me, no photo person would ever ask me this, but that's a very interesting question. he said, well, my wife Ginger had 2 different MGBs in the 70s, and we both really like them, and they do recur in my pictures. And that's an entirely legitimate way of responding to those pictures. I know we all kind of laugh because we're all like photo people, capital P, in this room. But we mustn't forget just how much, you know, information and therefore how many points of access there are to photographs. It's a great story. It's very humbling in a way.
Can we take a few questions from the audience? We have a lot of diverse people here who are very knowledgeable about the field. We have wonderful writers, photographers, and artists, and it'd be nice to hear.
There's a roaming mic.
Yeah, there's.
Hello. David, the only other time that I've ever heard you speak, you said something that I think about every other day.
Whoa. Was it about photography?
Yeah, it's when Handful of Dust came out.
Oh, yeah.
You said that the truths of a society aren't in their castles, but it's in their garbage. That's sort of like a summarization of what it was that you said. And I feel like that sort of ties into what you've all been talking about towards the end of this conversation, that like the reimagination that happens in the disposable, which I think is really like, I like thinking about photography in a sort of disposable way. It's sort of inescapable that that's a part of it, and the reimagination that happens.
I can't take much credit for that. That's actually Charles Baudelaire, who's
Thank you for handing it down to me.
His kind of leitmotif was always, the rag picker, the person going through the trash. That they're more likely to, in the modern era, they're more likely to offer up a better assessment of society than, looking at its rulers.
Do you think that there's some sort of truth? I mean, maybe it's just my own sort of theory about the relationship to photography and being somewhat disposable. Do you?
I guess photography gave us access to. I'm not so interested in photography as being disposable or not. That's neither here nor there, because anything can be thrown away. But it gave us access, at least at the descriptive level, to commonplace things in a way that turns all photographs turns things into signs of themselves. You don't know what those signs mean, but they definitely signify differently once they get into pictures. And a lot of the great photographers were interested in extremely commonplace things, and a lot of photographers made no distinction between the typical and the exceptional in terms of what they photographed. It doesn't surprise me at all that Irving Penn would photograph people who have visited from the planet Beautiful one day and cigarette butts the next. Photography doesn't photography doesn't discern in that way. And yeah, maybe that's coming back to Charles's point of always having one foot in the basement. You know, I think it's a good thing.
Some more questions? Maybe we should ask the audience what they think. Ask them.
Joshua. Come on.
I won't burn you. No. I'm curious if there's a particular kind of photography that you find the most difficult to write about or think about.
Yeah. William Eggleston. I've never read anything that's really added to my experience of his pictures. You know, even that John Schakowsky essay is a kind of rambling circumnavigation around how difficult it is to say anything about those pictures. And I'm certainly aware that there are lots of kinds of photographs that don't open themselves up to my ways of writing or thinking about. I'm sure they do for other people, although it'll be hard. I mean, maybe someone has read something great about Eggleston. I never have, and I'm constantly looking. It's great. I mean, I really admire them, and he is someone I go to when I ever get jaded about photography. I will open up a book of his work and just marvel. But maybe it raises a deeper question of why someone ends up with. Well, I'm always frustrated by the fact that I don't know if I'm a specialist or not. Because on the one hand, I have written other things. I've written fiction and I have written about film, but I know that 95% of it is about photography. So on the one hand, I must be some kind of specialist. But on the other hand, photography opens up to so much that I never feel like a specialist.
Well, just an observation. You're not an academic in your writing at all. You write because you're trying to investigate, I think, in very readable language without the jargon and without the kind of talking to the cognoscenti necessarily, but being one yourself.
Yeah.
And there's other writers in here who write like that. And then there are writers who I find impenetrable, who are trying to prove something through someone's work, or in fact, sycophantic to the work because it's already in a kind of canon of whatever. I think you're trying to find out what the work says. And I don't mean that as complimentary as I'm not trying to praise you, but that is why I think your books and essays are so useful.
Yeah.
And perhaps that you accept the enigma of photography in all its forms.
I do that.
I'm not trying to put it in a little box.
I always liked. Yeah, I mean, it was if I have a style of writing, I don't think it's a style, but an approach to writing, for me was a political gesture, because I noticed that what was happening in the discussion of culture generally, when I sort of started out as a writer, was in a kind of extreme dumbing down on the one hand, and a kind of isolation in sort of academic ivory towers at the other. I mean, it's worse in America than anywhere else. You know, as Leonard Cohen said, America is the cradle of the best and of the worst. And intelligent cultural discussion needs to take place in more or less popular arenas, and there should be people who are trying to do it. And And that was a very conscious move on my part. Yeah, I mean, I've written for the specialist academic peer review journals, and once you've done it, that's a box ticked. I would never do it again.
You like the term public intellectual?
Yeah, that's gone out of fashion, hasn't it, a bit? I mean, maybe it comes back to the Sontag thing. I mean, I liked everything she wrote apart from the stuff about photography, but and she gets a bad rap these days as being some kind of high-minded, ascetic modernist. Jesus Christ, give her a break. You can have a few of those. And was never in the academy. Was never, you know. And that should be defended, I think. Hi there.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the meaning of an image changing over time or with the times. ...
Yeah, I mentioned that that's a big part of what I discuss with Susan Mercedes. I also discuss it with Jeff Wall, interestingly, who's he's been working for maybe 40 years and he's constantly reviewing his own work. And so he's constantly thinking about what his past images mean now. I mean, I'm of the view that if you're looking at something and it means something to you, it must be contemporary. If I look at a painting by Chardin in the National Gallery in London, I know full well that it wasn't even painted in this century or the last. But I also know I can't time travel, and I'm looking at it now. There is only now. Like a hippie. But photographs have a very complicated relation to the passage through time. Because on the one hand, there is an idea of photograph being a fixing of something, but not of meaning, really not of meaning. And the gap between the kind of physical fixing of an impression and the absolute instability of its meaning, its profound ambiguity and its profound ability to be shaped by how it's used, where it's used, that's quite disarming. But I think particularly if you study photography, you have to come to terms with that. Because when you study, you're supposed to be thinking about intention a lot, and then you realize that it's not going to happen. Things you can try your best, but you don't know how a picture is going to become significant. Walker Evans was asked, "How do you what's the secret of making a good photograph?" And he said, "Take any photograph and wait 30 years." Which again is the foot in the basement thing. However lofty your intentions, you don't know why certain photographs become significant. Why, have you got something on your mind? What were you thinking about behind?
Sometimes there's right now for me, thinking of my relationship with my own photography, why I make imagery, understanding that over the years, but in terms of the academic structure, studying post-colonialism and voices that are now being heard or now have a larger platform that didn't before.
Yeah.
So images that people may be quite familiar with in one context, they are now receiving new light, and they're receiving a new sort of narrative because so much time or enough time has gone by to allow that to come to the fore.
Yeah.
So it's sort of fascinating to me in that particular sense.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that Oliver Wendell Holmes essay, and I love coming across these things within the history of photography where the more time you spend with the history of photography, the more you realize extraordinary things were done way earlier than you thought. Way earlier. I remember the first time I had a conversation with Jeff Wall, I'd actually just come from the New York Public Library, actually, and I'd looked at every page of every issue of Life magazine. Someone's got to do it. So that's 36 years, 52 issues a year. It took me 2 weeks. Boy, do you come across interesting things. But I came across this piece in 1952 of images that were made as illustrations of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, the novel. And it turned out, I was reading one of the Gordon Parks autobiographies. There's a few volumes of it. And he said that Ellison was living with him when he was trying to finish it and knew it was going to be a great novel, although it's very sort of episodic. And Gordon Parks was on the staff of Life, and he went to the editors and said, my mate Ralph's about to publish what I think is going to be the greatest novel of the 20th century. And can we do something in the magazine? And so they make these pictures, including a shot which is now well known since Parks died, because more and more of his archive is being looked at, of this shot from the prologue of the novel, where the narrator falls down a garbage chute in a riot, ends up in the basement of a building, and decides to write the great novel about what it is to be black in America, sort of mid-century. And he takes electricity from the room above, and he has a room full of light in a basement. And Parks and Ellison set it up. They built the set and everything. And Jeff Wall had done the same thing. He'd read the same novel. I mean, I defy any photographer to read that novel and not think of 100 images when they're reading it. It's a very imagistic book. And I had the nerve to show it to Jeff Wall, to basically say, look, Ralph Ellison and Gordon Parks did what you did 50 years before. Artists are going to respond in two ways. They're either going to be very defensive and egotistical, or they're going to embrace the lineage, just think, wow, that's amazing, which, to his credit, Jeff Wall did. But at the time I was talking to him, I knew that the only place that existed was on that page of Life magazine in 1952. And, coming back to the ephemeral question, most interesting photography in the 20th century was made for magazines that got thrown away. And a big part of the history of photography still is fishing things out of the trash. It really is. It's all in the basement. You got to go dig around, and there's amazing stuff in there.
What's going to happen to these trash Instagram and all this digital imagery? Because we're not sure they're going to sync up with. And certainly people's phones are going to be thrown away. Most of their
Yeah, I was at the Comedy Cellar at the weekend, and this comedian had this great routine. I can't remember his name. I'm really sorry. He had this great routine about this. He said, I remember when I was a kid, and my father showed me a picture of my great-great-grandfather, and he held it in his trembling hands, and it was this, kind of dog-eared fragment, and said, this is the only known image of your great-great-great-grandfather. And then he said, imagine this in 5 generations' time, where a father turns to the son and says, do you want to see 100,000 photographs of your great-great-grandfather? And do you want to know what he was doing every minute of his life? Well, that's the problem we're going to have to face. But they'll still be digging around in the trash, I can tell you that.
David, is there a difference photograph and the image?
You've got an answer to that. Nobody asks a question like that without having one.
You want to have a chat?
Go for it.
I'm curious about what. Speak up.
Go for it.
I mean, that photograph above you that is above your name. I would assume that photograph is considered the cloud has moved into the frame. There's, I arrive with design principles. There's perspective, rhythm, contrast, whatever you want to include. It's a photograph. I'm wondering nowadays should we be discussing not just photography but image making?
Yeah.
And who's doing that? Because I want to read more about it. If you're not doing it.
Victor Bergin does it a lot. His book, new collection of essays, The Camera, traces the point, goes from the point where there was some idea of a kind of certainty about what a camera image is to the point where we don't even know if a camera was involved, and maybe it's best to just think about it as an image. Still a lot of the French thinkers. Bernd Stiegler is very good on the image. More generally, yeah. Email me. Well, what's your thought about that? That somehow
I'm currently more interested in the image than the photograph.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's because of the mobile phone or the smartphone.
Yeah.
That just allows me to be a little bit more aggressive or nonchalant. I can disregard all the things that I was taught on how to make a photo or compose a photograph. I find that the image somehow allows the viewer to time travel and almost, if viewed on the same smartphone, it feels like they had a hand in making it. Maybe they made it themselves. I look at that and I see the photographer, and maybe I'm not interested in seeing the photographer anymore.
Oh well, yeah, probably Roland Barthes is still your man, because he really felt that as soon as he sensed the presence of a photographer, it was over for him. What was essential about photography really had nothing to do with the photographer.
Yeah.
Of course, that got on the nerves of a lot of photographers, but it should have excluded him from the curriculum. But he still holds pride of place, interestingly enough. And I think this idea of, so does Sontag too, that within photographic education you should be encountering people who think it's a bad object somehow, or nothing wrong with that, because I think the balance of suspicion about photography, we should all be suspicious about it. Imagine if you were teaching 10-year-olds about photography, and you imagine the visual environment they're in, you'd want them to be suspicious about it. At the same time, if you wanted them to be, let's call it image makers, you'd want them to have some kind of affection for it too. And the balance between suspicion and affection is very difficult to strike. It's a very difficult thing, because too much suspicion without affection leads to cynicism, and too much affection without suspicion leads to sentimentalism. And we are caught. It's not that if you enter the field of photography, you are caught between those two things. Everybody is between affection and suspicion, I think, somehow. But I think for a long time, what was called the critical writing about photography was critical of it, not critical about it. It was critical of it. Had to denounce it. Had to kind of pull it down. But that doesn't explain the fascination for it. It doesn't leave room for the affection for it. I struggle with that all the time. The affection, suspicion, balance it's hard. It's difficult.
Let's get one more question, because we have to have a book sale here. We got to pay for
Oh, yeah.
We got a lot of books to sell, a
You-
lot of all you can buy books. It's a big time. So one more
Yeah, yeah.
question. Anybody have that question?
Can I ask?
Yes.
Where does the title come from? So present, so invisible.
Alessandra, who is it that mentions it in
Was mentioning in.
I've forgotten now. Oh, Daniel Blaufuchs, one of the
The quote.
he mentions it. He describes photography as being so present, so invisible, kind of everywhere and nowhere, and that's why it's difficult to think about it sometimes. Yes. Blaufuchs, not so well known Portuguese photographic artist. Thanks for coming, folks.
Thank you. And you can ask them a few questions up there.
Yeah, you buy it, I'll sign it.
And they're copies of the photo book review that David edited right up here for you.
Very good.